Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're going to completely demystify how the modern world actually connects by analyzing the real anatomy of the global economy. You know, we hear terms like globalization thrown around literally every day, but how much of what we assume is actually true? Today we're going to break down the mechanics of global production networks to show you exactly how the world makes, moves, and consumes everything around us.
Okay, let's dive into this. You hear it all the time, right? That capital has become hypermobile, completely freed from the tyranny of physical distance. We're constantly told that economic activity is totally deterritorialized, like it's just floating freely in some spaceless, placeless void where companies can pack up and move anywhere at the drop of a hat. But is that actually the reality? Well, absolutely not. The idea of a perfectly borderless economy is an incredibly seductive myth, but it's fundamentally misleading. As we're about to see, the global economy is deeply, profoundly anchored to the physical Earth.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll explain global production networks. Second, services and financialization. Third, the 5 major actors. Fourth, uneven power dynamics. And finally, why geography still matters.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Global Production Networks Explained.
The foundation of our entire economy relies on these things called global production networks, or GPNs. Now, when I say global, I don't mean these networks just blanket the whole world evenly. Instead, they're highly extensive geographically. But here's the absolute crucial part. They are territorially embedded. Every single component in a GPN, every firm, every little economic function is quite literally grounded in a specific physical location. They rely completely on the built environment, local institutions, and the very distinctive cultural practices of the actual places they operate in.
At its core, a GPN operates as a really dynamic two-way circuit. It's not just a simple one-way chain where you pump inputs in one end and get a finished product out the other. Sure, materials and products flow in one direction, but information, customer orders, and critical data, that's all flowing right back in the exact opposite direction. And wrapping around this entire physical process are these vital layers of technology, energy, services, and regulation that hold the whole shebang together.
Moving right along to Section 2, Services and Financialization.
So, within these physical production circuits, advanced business services do double duty. They're produced within their own networks, sure, but they're also totally fundamental to making the physical networks function in the first place. Think about logistics for a second. Logistics isn't just about loading boxes onto cargo ships. It involves the absolutely vital transmission and manipulation of information. Logistics services provide those crucial transactional connections that bind together production and circulation. They're essentially the glue that integrates and coordinates these super-atomized, geographically spread out segments into one cohesive global machine.
But driving these logistical decisions is an even deeper force, financialization. This has been described as an all-pervasive system of values based on the overriding prioritization of an equity culture, in which shareholder value and profitability have become central to all aspects of economic activity. So what does that actually mean? Well, this shareholder value revolution means that traditionally non-financial firms, like your everyday manufacturers, are now acting almost like financial holding companies. They'll geographically break up and scatter the production of goods, specifically to maintain markups and deliver those short-run returns to shareholders. So finance isn't just a service. It's literally shaping the physical map of global production.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 5 major actors.
Now, what's really interesting about this multi-dimensional tug-of-war is figuring out who's actually pulling the strings. We've got 5 main players here: transnational corporations, or TNCs, along with states, labor, consumers, and civil society organizations. All 5 of these actors are continuously engaged in this deeply dynamic relationship. They're constantly negotiating, constantly struggling over the rules and norms of the economy. And the kicker? They all have totally different goals, totally different tools, and most importantly, different levels of mobility.
Let's compare 2 of the biggest heavyweights, transnational corporations and labor. TNCs are the ultimate coordinators. They have this massive advantage of geographical flexibility. They can switch resources and operations between locations all over the globe to find the best tax rates or the cheapest resources. But labor? Labor is incredibly place-bound. As the geographer David Harvey so brilliantly put it, unlike other commodities, labor power has to go home every night. Workers are deeply embedded in their local communities, which creates this massive spatial asymmetry between footloose corporate capital on one side and place-bound human beings on the other.
And you know, this asymmetry has massive real-world consequences. Because TNCs operate across huge global distances, their corporate decision-making is often incredibly remote. That makes it exceptionally difficult for labor to organize effectively across national borders. I mean, just look at the United States. The proportion of the labor force organized into unions plummeted from 20% in 1983 down to just around 12% 30 years later. While the effective global labor supply was literally quadrupling as countries like China joined the global economy, the highly localized nature of labor left workers at a really severe bargaining disadvantage against globally mobile capital.
But hey, production isn't just about making things in a vacuum. It's driven entirely by consumers, by us. The old days when Henry Ford could say, you can have any color car you want as long as it's black, are long, long gone. Today's production is driven not just by basic survival needs, but by incredibly complex social and cultural wants. We've seen this massive explosion of positional goods, products that are valuable simply because they send a social message signifying a certain lifestyle or attitude. And because consumer diversity and local tastes are remarkably stubborn around the world, TNCs can't just sell one standardized product everywhere. Ultimately, consumers dictate the flow of these production circuits.
Our final major actors are global civil society organizations, or GCSOs. There has been a literal hockey stick curve in the growth of these organizations over the last century. Because labor and consumers often feel kind of powerless when facing off against massive TNCs on their own, they've increasingly turned to GCSOs to organize on a transnational scale. Thanks to the internet and social media, environmental and human rights groups can now instantly collaborate across borders to name and shame corporate bad behavior. They're applying the pressure needed to keep transnational capital in check.
All right, let's jump into Section 4, Uneven Power Dynamics.
So, the crucial point here is that the global economy is just this constant complex power play. It forms a triangular nexus of interactions. You've got firm-to-firm competition, state-to-state relations, and firm-state negotiations all happening at once. TNCs are constantly trying to take advantage of national differences in regulations, basically doing regulatory arbitrage. Meanwhile, states are trying to minimize that arbitrage and manage the very territories where these networks operate. They're trying to attract lucrative investment while still protecting their own domestic economies.
Power in these networks is highly asymmetrical, and it usually boils down to two things: control over key localized assets, like specialized tech or natural resources, and the spatial flexibility to simply get up and move. But here's the wild part. This power dynamic is never ever fixed. These actors exist in a constant state of simultaneous cooperation and conflict. TNCs are absolutely fierce competitors, but they also form these huge strategic alliances with each other. States compete ruthlessly to land mobile investment, yet they turn around and form regional trading blocs. Even labor unions both collaborate internationally while competing locally. It's a non-stop balancing act.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Why Geography Still Matters. Despite the incredible, sprawling, global reach of these networks, economic activity is emphatically not dispersed evenly. If you step back and look at the real data, you definitely do not see a flat, borderless world. Instead, economic activity clumps together heavily. The world is geographically spiky. The global economy is basically made up of a series of highly localized agglomerations. Economists call them sticky places that operate within the seemingly slippery space of global capital flows.
Let's see how this builds. If you were to map out the world's major cities by population, you wouldn't see an even spread of lights, you'd see massive, distinct clusters. The single most defining feature of the global economic map is the absolute dominance of these localized clusters, particularly global cities that contain huge, super dense concentrations of financial services and corporate headquarters.
But why do these sticky places even exist in the first place? Well, they form based on the idea of externalities, or positive spillovers. Simply put, spatial proximity provides massive benefits. Because activities in a specific place are so deeply connected, the whole of the cluster becomes way greater than the sum of its individual parts. Being physically close to your suppliers, your competitors, and your specialized workforce creates economic efficiencies that you just can't get by being out on your own.
Now, these clusters generally take two main forms. First, generalized clusters, or urbanization economies. Think of massive cities where firms cluster together just to share broad infrastructure, highways, incredibly varied labor pools, huge consumer bases. The larger the city, the more diverse the facilities. On the flip side, we have specialized clusters, or localization economies. This happens when firms from the exact same industry cluster really closely together to form industrial districts, like the famous high fashion and leather districts in Italy.
They do this to create direct, traded interdependencies that massively cut down on their transportation and transaction costs.
But beyond just saving a few bucks on shipping, clusters rely on something way more human: untraded interdependencies. It sounds academic, but really we're talking about the less tangible yet utterly essential benefits of being physically near each other. Shared business institutions, specialized local universities, deep sociocultural interactions, and above all else, it's about face-to-face contact. Actually being in the same room remains the single most important glue for innovation, knowledge sharing, and trust in the global economy. You just can't replicate that magic over an email or a video call.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Because these clusters grow through a cumulative process, they become extremely path-dependent. Their future is heavily influenced by historical accident and local context. Cities rise, they get locked into patterns of immense wealth, or sometimes they lose their edge and fall into steep decline. Understanding this completely shifts how we see the world. So looking at the complex web of global production we've just explored, think about your own hometown. Is the geography around you currently feeding a virtuous circle of innovation and growth, or is it facing the rigidities of decline within this massive, heavily localized global machine? Keep that in mind next time someone tells you the economy is completely borderless. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.